Well, today marks 1 week since that deadly shooting along Toronto's Danforth Avenue, and people are still shaken, not just by that shooting rampage of that night, but also by the increase in gun violence in Canada's largest city. Now, the number of people killed by guns has risen over the last 5 years in Toronto, the highest number being in 2016 with 41 deaths. That number went down slightly last year, but so far in 2018, only halfway into this year, 29 people have already been killed in Toronto by a shooting. That is raising fears that 2018 might be the deadliest year so far. So that brings us to this question. How do you stop gun violence in a city like Toronto? Joining us now is Joseph Smith, the co-founder of the nonprofit organization Generation Chosen, and Mike McCormack, the president of the Toronto Police Association. Thank you to the two of you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Mike, I want to begin with you. You and I have talked through the years, and I always appreciate our conversations. And when we talk about gun violence in the city and stopping gun violence, and really not only in Toronto, but other cities across this country, you talk about something that you've termed as proactive policing. What do you mean by that?
What I mean by proactive policing is basically community-based policing and having officers embedded in the community. And again, when we're talking about proactive policing, and we're talking about gun violence, there is no magic pill that's just going to, and people, when we see this type of violence, are looking for a very simple solution. Let's just blame this or look at this one aspect, whether it's gun control, policing, socioeconomic issues, social issues. It is all of those things, and it is a very complex problem. But what it requires, from a policing perspective, is that proactive community-based policing, where we have officers that are embedded in the communities, working with the communities to deal with violence in a policing capacity. And we've seen a very successful model of this in New York City, for instance, where two and a half hours roughly of every shift from an officer is spent doing proactive, working with the community on programs. And what we've seen is a huge decrease in violence, a huge decrease in murders. And again, having those officers available to do that, having the right amount of police officers. New York hired police officers. They went to this neighborhood community policing model, but they had the right amount of police officers. And it's one of the things that will help this violence, along with these other things, social programs and everything else.
Yeah, well, Joseph, you work at the grassroots level. Yeah. What's your reaction to that proposal?
Well, I agree. We would need proactive policing, but concomitantly with that, we would need proactive teachers, proactive mental health practitioners that can be embedded in the community, just as you're saying, and working on the back end to kind of ensure that these issues can be prevented into the future. The model he's speaking of, it only works well if there's community supports and also meaningful police officers stationed within the communities.
And you're nodding your head yes, because you believe that this is a greater integration issue.
Right, yeah, and again, like as Joseph was saying, and having worked in Regent Park most of my career and working within the community, it's one
Which is a neighborhood in Toronto, we should point out to the rest of the country, that is traditionally challenged.
Right, and again, no, it's that has some socioeconomic challenges, but again, part of the thing about the policing component and why we were so successful in Regent Park in the community police is because we had a very robust community involvement and these social networks. We're there to police, and we bring one component, but you must have the social piece to do that for a long term. We have to get into, and I believe that where we're going to fix this problem of shooting is that the answers are going to come from the community and the police. That's where the answers are going to come from. That's where this thing's going to fix, not the bureaucrats, not banning guns, but how do you get into the psyche of somebody who's going to go out there and kill somebody, shoot somebody? That's where we're going to rely on people like Joseph to get to that.
Well, as Mike says that, Joseph, I have heard those arguments before, and I certainly understand the logic of that, but I also know, as covering crime in this city and other cities in this country, that there is a gap in trust between community members and the police. So how do you bridge that trust as you talk about integrating and increasing the number of police officers you see within a community?
Well, it starts off by realizing that society is malleable and relationships can be altered and changed. It really depends on who's at the forefront of this change. And if you have individuals at the table willing to work collaboratively and not in silos, because we're not going to fix this problem if we're operating in silos, then I think that change can actually occur. And the kind of approach he's talking about is building relationships that go beyond the superficialities of, day-to-day exchanges, but something where an individual who is suffering in the community can call on a mental health practitioner, an educator even, or a police officer directly in that moment and receive the attention and the care that they need.
Well, as I say, this is not the first time we've talked about community policing. It comes up every time there's the rise in gun violence. So what's the gap? If the knowledge and the proposal is there, why isn't it being carried through?
Well, again, from my perspective, and speaking, on the policing side, we have a huge resource issue right now. We're down 800 police officers. We don't have the commitment. So what we have is a police service right now that is going from call to call in a reactive mode, and our officers are continue to be, as I said, in reactive. So there's no time for that proactive piece. So it doesn't give them time to deal with these issues where we need to have the officers embedded in these communities and deal, so we can build the trust, build the relationships that we need to do. And that's what's suffering right now from our perspective in the policing. But as I said at the beginning, it's not just a policing issue. We got to deal with the socioeconomic issues of opportunity. I think together, this is a collaborative approach, as Joseph said, that we can all work together, but we should be working to solve this issue and maintain it so it doesn't happen again.
And you're saying absolutely.
Yeah, we can't have our police officers burnt out. And if they're always having to respond to issues that would be better serviced by other institutions like mental health or educational institutions, then what we're going to have is them being the primary preventers and reactors to crime. And that's too much to ask for any one institution. It can't work unilaterally. We have to work collaboratively.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
As we talk about this, though, we have heard from Toronto City Council, part of their reaction is to invest in technology, as in the shot stopper technology. They've also talked about asking Ottawa to ban guns altogether in cities like Toronto. What do you make of that proposal? Is that the right focus and response?
So for the shot spotter, so what we looked at in other jurisdictions and just that technology, and what that is that a camera gets activated when it hears the sounds of gunshots. So if I don't have officers to respond to that, what good is that going to do? So in the first place. But in the second place, again, that's a reactive component where, that's something that we need to deal with in policing. We need to be able to react to solve these crimes when they happen. But that's another reactive component.
Yeah.
So how are we going to prevent the shootings? And when we talk about the gun control issue, we have the largest unprotected border in the world with a country that has a proliferation of guns. So, I think these are all great intentions, but I'm going to go back to it and say it's going to be people like Joseph, people like in the policing community who are going to really come forward with the ideas to solve and how we do this, dealing with mental health issues, the community, and policing.
Well, to that, Joseph, are political leaders reaching out to people like Mike McCormack, people like Joseph Smith, to try to find the solutions here, or are they just reacting gutturally almost at the council level?
Yeah, it's because these issues incite fear and they incite anger and sadness, and it's hard to really think clearly when you're filled with all these emotions. So what we are going to need to have is a real meaningful conversation where we're all at the table and discussing a collaborative approach to dealing with this issue.
Have political leaders reached out enough to you?
Well, I can't speak for Joseph, but again, I've been in conversation with City Hall. I've been in conversation with the chief, the chair, and the premier to talk about this. We have a meeting coming up with the province where we're going to be discussing this. But again, speaking from the policing perspective, what we need as a resource to combat this, but also we are not only looking at it from the policing lens and saying, okay, we need the resources, but we also need to have the sustainable pieces, as Joseph was talking about as well. We're not just championing the policing piece. That's what we definitely need to deal with this, but we also need to deal with the social piece.
And if the solutions are going to come from the ground, are political leaders speaking enough to grassroots organizations like yours?
Yeah, I've had a few city councillors contact me and speak, but nothing has transpired or manifested itself yet. Hopefully, in the coming months, something meaningful and concrete can get put down on paper, and we can work towards fixing this issue.
Okay. Well, we're out of time, and I apologize for that, but thank you for the conversation. Obviously, just the beginning. We'll speak again. Thank you to the two of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that's Joseph Smith, the co-founder of Generation Chosen, Mike McCormack, the president of the Toronto Police Association, both of them joining us in studio.